The morning fog clung to the Vietnamese highlands like a wet blanket, thick enough to taste. Sergeant Cole Matthews wiped the condensation from his rifle scope for the third time in as many minutes, his calloused fingers moving with practiced efficiency, despite the tremor he'd never quite managed to suppress. February 1973, and the war that wasn't supposed to exist anymore still breathed its last violent gasps in these forgotten corners of Southeast Asia. "How much further, Sarge?" Private William Hayes whispered from behind, his young face streaked with mud and exhaustion. At 19, Billy was the youngest in the unit, fresh-faced enough that his first attempts at growing a mustache had become a running joke among the men. Cole checked his compass again, squinting through the mist at the barely visible trail ahead. 2 clicks to the extraction point, maybe 3 if this fog doesn't lift. His voice was low, barely audible over the constant drip of moisture from the canopy above. "Keep your intervals tight, but not too tight. We're almost home." Home. The word felt foreign on his tongue. Cole had been in country for 18 months, long enough to forget what Kansas wheat fields smelled like, long enough that the weight of his M16 felt more natural than his father's handshake ever had. At 32, he was older than most of the men he led, old enough to have a wife and 2 daughters waiting in Fort Riley, their faces growing hazier in his memory with each passing week. The patrol consisted of 8 men, Delta Company's 2nd platoon, reduced from its original 12 after a roadside bomb 2 weeks prior. They'd been sent to recon a suspected enemy supply route, a mission that command swore would be their last before the final withdrawal. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed 3 weeks ago, but nobody had bothered to tell the North Vietnamese army that the fighting was supposed to stop. "I don't like this, Cole." That was Corporal Jack Morrison, walking point 15 meters ahead. Jack was from Boston, a mechanic in civilian life who could strip and reassemble an engine blindfolded, but moved through the jungle with surprising grace. Too quiet. Even the birds shut up. Cole felt it too, that electric tension in the air that every combat veteran learned to recognize. The jungle had its own rhythm, its own language of sounds and silences. When that rhythm broke, death usually followed close behind. "Hold up!" Cole raised his fist, and the column froze. 8 men became 8 statues, barely breathing, weapons at the ready. The fog swirled around them like ghosts, and for a moment the only sound was the hammering of Cole's heart against his ribs. Then the world exploded. The first RPG screamed out of the tree line to their left, a tail of fire cutting through the fog before slamming into the ground 5 meters from Morrison's position. The blast threw him sideways into a tangle of roots, and suddenly the air was alive with the crack of AK-47 fire, the deeper boom of an RPD machine gun, the screams of men caught in the open. "Ambush left! Ambush left!" Cole was moving before his conscious mind caught up, dropping to one knee behind a fallen log, returning fire at muzzle flashes barely visible through the mist. "Get to cover! Move! Move! Move!" Private Robert Turner went down first, clutching his thigh as a burst of automatic fire caught him mid-stride. Corporal Henry Carter grabbed him by the drag handle on his vest, hauling him behind a boulder while rounds kicked up dirt all around them. "How bad?" Cole shouted over the chaos, emptying a magazine toward the enemy position before dropping behind cover to reload. "Through and through, but he's bleeding heavy." Hank's voice was tight with controlled panic. The big man from Alabama had been a paramedic before the Army, and his hands were already working on Turner's leg, applying pressure, reaching for his aid kit. "Need to get a tourniquet on this." The ambush was textbook perfect, catching them in a natural choke point with nowhere to retreat. Cole's mind raced through options, all of them bad. They were outnumbered, possibly surrounded, and the fog that had seemed like a blessing now trapped them in a deadly gray void where every shadow might be an enemy soldier. "Frank! Charlie! Set up a base of fire on that fallen tree!" Cole pointed toward a massive teak trunk 20 meters to their right. Privates. Frank Donovan and Charles Brooks scrambled toward it. their rifles barking as they moved. "Billy, Eddie, you're with me. We're gonna flank left and see if we can find their flank." "Are you insane?" Private Edward Lane, a school teacher from Oregon in his previous life, stared at Cole with wide eyes. "That's where most of the fire's coming from. Exactly why they won't expect it." Cole checked his remaining magazines. 4 left. Maybe 120 rounds between life and death. "They think they've got us pinned. We prove them wrong or we die here. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice, and they all knew it. Eddie nodded once, his jaw set despite the fear dancing in his eyes. Billy Hayes just gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white against the dark metal. The firefight had been raging for maybe 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. Cole could hear Morrison shouting coordinates into the radio, trying to raise anyone who might send help, but the fog played hell with transmissions, and they were operating at the edge of their communication range anyway. "On my mark," Cole said, his eyes tracking the rhythm of enemy fire, looking for the gap. 3, 2, 1, go! They broke from cover in a dead sprint, angling left through the undergrowth. Bullets snapped past Cole's head close enough to feel the displacement of air. A round tugged at his sleeve, another kicked up dirt at his feet, but momentum carried him forward into the teeth of the enemy position. He saw them then, 3 NVA soldiers crouched behind a natural berm, their attention focused forward on what they thought was the entirety of the American patrol. Cole's rifle came up smooth as silk, and he fired 3 controlled bursts. The first soldier went down without a sound. The second spun and tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Eddie was there, his M16 barking twice, and the man crumpled. The third soldier was faster, younger, and managed to get off a burst that caught Eddie in the shoulder, spinning him around. Billy Hayes, blessed with the reflexes of youth and the desperation of survival, put 2 rounds center mass before the enemy soldier could fire again. "Eddie!" Cole grabbed the wounded man as he started to fall. Blood was spreading across Eddie's left shoulder, but he was conscious, breathing. I'm okay," Eddie gasped, though his face had gone pale. "Hurts like hell, but I can move." "We gotta keep going," Billy said, his voice shaking now that the adrenaline rush was starting to ebb. "Sarge, there's more of them out there." He was right. Cole could hear Vietnamese voices shouting orders somewhere deeper in the fog, the sound of boots moving through brush. The ambush had been larger than just the 3 soldiers they'd neutralized. Much larger. "Back to the others. Now." Cole supported Eddie as they retreated, moving carefully but quickly. The main firefight was still raging, but it sounded different now, more sporadic. Either the enemy was running low on ammunition, or they were maneuvering for a better position. When they reached the rest of the unit, Cole found Morrison hunched over the radio, his face grim. "Can't raise anyone. Something's jamming us, or we're in a dead zone, or—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Or nobody's listening because we're not supposed to be here anymore." "Casualties?" Cole asked, though he could see most of it himself. "Turner's stable but can't walk. Eddie makes 2 wounded. Morrison's got some shrapnel in his leg from that first RPG, nothing serious." That was Hank Carter, his hands still red with Turner's blood. "We're down to maybe 400 rounds total, and I'm almost out of medical supplies." Cole did the math in his head. 2 wounded, 1 critical. Limited ammunition. No radio contact. Enemy forces of unknown size somewhere in the fog around them. The extraction point might as well have been on the moon. "What's the call, Sarge?" Jack Morrison asked. There was no judgment in his voice, just a soldier waiting for orders from the man he trusted to keep him alive. Cole looked at each of them in turn. These men, his men, looking back at him with fear and exhaustion and that stubborn core of resilience that kept soldiers moving forward when every rational instinct screamed to run. Billy Hayes, barely old enough to vote. Frank Donovan, with his wife's picture tucked in his helmet band. Charlie Brooks, who wrote poetry in a little notebook during the quiet moments. Thomas Reeve, their quiet demolitions expert, who hadn't said 3 words since the ambush started. Hank Carter with his gentle hands now covered in blood. Eddie Lane trying not to show how much pain he was in. Bobby Turner drifting in and out of consciousness on the ground. Jack Morrison, always cracking jokes to keep morale up, now silent and waiting. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Cole said finally. "We move together or we don't move at all. Turner and Eddie can't walk far, so we find somewhere defensible and we dig in. When the fog lifts, we signal for extraction. Until then, we hold." "And if the NVA find us first?" Frank Donovan asked. Cole checked his rifle, chambering a fresh round with a metallic click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. "Then we remind them why they should have accepted that peace accord." The decision made, they moved with purpose. Thomas Reeve found a depression in the hillside about 50 meters away, a natural bowl surrounded by rocks and heavy vegetation. It wasn't Fort Knox, but it was defensible, with good sight lines and limited approaches. They carried Turner between them, the big man gritting his teeth against the pain of movement. Eddie insisted on walking under his own power, though Hank stayed close beside him. They moved in silence, every man acutely aware that the enemy was out there somewhere, listening, hunting. The fog was starting to thin as afternoon approached, burning off in patches that revealed a landscape both beautiful and terrifying. Steep hillsides covered in triple canopy jungle, ravines that dropped away into shadow, and somewhere out there, an unknown number of enemy soldiers who knew these mountains like their own backyards. Cole set up their defensive position with the methodical care of a man who'd done this too many times before. Morrison and Brooks on the western approach, Donovan and Reeve covering the east, Billy Hayes and Hank Carter watching their 6. Cole himself took the north, where the terrain dropped away into a narrow ravine, and tried not to think about how exposed they were. "Sarge!" Billy crawled up beside him, his young face smudged with mud and powder residue. "You think they're gonna come?" Cole didn't insult the kid's intelligence with false optimism. "Yeah, I think they're gonna come." "What do?" "We do our job, Billy. We hold this position, we protect our wounded, and we survive until help arrives. And if help doesn't come?" Cole looked at the private, really looked at him. 19 years old, whole life ahead of him, drafted into a war that was supposedly over. "Then we hold anyway, because that's what soldiers do." The afternoon stretched into evening, and with the setting sun came a clarity of air that felt almost cruel. They could see for hundreds of meters now, could see the valley below and the mountains beyond, could see the beauty of a land that had drunk so much blood it should have been red to the horizon. They also saw the enemy. Movement, 2 o'clock, about 300 meters. Morrison's voice was steady, professional. "Count at least 15, probably more in the tree line." Cole raised his binoculars, and his stomach dropped. Not 15, closer to 30, maybe 40. A full platoon at least, moving with the confidence of men who knew they had their prey trapped. "They know where we are," Hank said quietly. "They're gonna wait until dark." He was right. The NVA weren't in a hurry. They could afford to take their time, let fear and darkness do half their work for them. By midnight, they'd move in, and Cole's 8 men would face 5-to-1 odds in a fight they couldn't win. Cole gathered his men as the sun touched the western peaks. "I'm not gonna lie to you. We're in a bad spot. Real bad. But we've got some advantages. High ground, good fields of fire, and we've got each other." He paused, looking at each face in turn. "Command thinks we're already dead. The war's supposed to be over. Nobody's coming to save us, because officially, we're not even here." "But we are here. We're alive, and we're going home, all of us, together." "How?" Eddie Lane asked, his voice tight with pain from his shoulder wound. "We make them pay for every meter. We fight smart, we fight mean, and we fight like 8 American soldiers are worth 100 of theirs. Because we are." It wasn't much of a speech, but it was honest. And in that moment, huddled in a hillside depression, while an enemy army gathered in the darkness below, honesty was all Cole had to give. Night fell like a hammer, and with it came the waiting. The worst part of any battle, Cole had learned, wasn't the fighting itself, but the moments before, when imagination ran wild and every shadow became death incarnate. They ate cold rations and drank sparingly from their canteens. Turner drifted in and out of morphine-dulled consciousness. Eddie's shoulder had stopped bleeding, but Hank warned that infection was a real risk if they didn't get him proper medical care soon. Morrison kept trying the radio, spinning dials and adjusting antennas, hoping against hope for a miracle that never came. At 2300 hours, the first probing attack came, a squad of NVA soldiers moving up the ravine to their north, testing the defenses. Cole let them get close, maybe 50 meters before opening fire. The night lit up with muzzle flashes, tracers drawing lines of fire through the darkness. 3 enemy soldiers went down in the initial volley, and the rest melted back into the jungle. "First round to us," Frank Donovan said, trying to keep his voice light. But they all knew what it meant. The enemy knew exactly where they were now, knew their firing positions, knew their strength. The real attack would come soon. It came at 0130, a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously. The world became sound and fury, the crack of rifles and the chatter of machine guns, the crump of grenades and the screams of wounded men on both sides. Cole fired until his rifle barrel glowed hot, changed magazines with fumbling fingers, fired again. Beside him, Billy Hayes fought with the desperate intensity of youth, his face a mask of concentration and terror. Morrison's machine gun hammered away at the western approach, holding back what seemed like an entire company of enemy soldiers through sheer volume of fire. Reeves' grenades bought them precious seconds, explosive delays that sent enemy soldiers diving for cover. But there were so many of them, and so few defenders. For every enemy soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. They kept coming, wave after wave, and Cole knew with sick certainty that his men couldn't hold much longer. "Sarge!" Hank Carter's voice cut through the chaos. "Turner's in bad shape. I need to—" The medic's words were cut off by a burst of fire that stitched across his position. Hank grunted and went down, clutching his side. "Hank!" Billy started to move toward the fallen medic, but Cole grabbed his collar. "Stay on your sector! I've got him!" Cole low-crawled across the position, bullets cracking over his head. Hank was conscious, pressing one hand against his ribs where blood was spreading across his uniform. "I'm okay," Hank gasped. "Went through. Hurts like hell, but I'm okay." But he wasn't okay, and they both knew it. 3 wounded now, ammunition running critically low, and the enemy just kept coming. Cole made it back to his position and grabbed the radio handset, knowing it was futile but needing to try anyway. Any station, this is Delta 2-3. We are under heavy attack, multiple casualties, need immediate extraction. How copy?" Static, just endless, mocking static. "Any station, this is Delta 2-3, requesting immediate—" "Delta 2-3, this is Falcon 1-6, I copy your transmission." Cole's heart nearly stopped. "Falcon 1-6, say again, who is this?" "This is Lieutenant Rick Kane, Falcon Company, 1st Cavalry. We're about 5 clicks north of your position. Got your distress call on guard frequency." "What's your situation?" "We're 8 men, 3 wounded, under attack by at least a reinforced platoon. We can hold maybe another hour, then we're out of ammunition and options." There was a pause, long enough that Cole thought he'd lost the connection. Then, "Roger, Delta 2-3, Falcon 1-6 is inbound with a full platoon. ETA 45 minutes. Can you hold?" Cole looked around at his exhausted wounded men, at the muzzle flashes in the darkness that seemed to be closing in from all sides. 45 minutes might as well have been 45 years. "We'll hold," he said, and meant it. "We'll hold." The words hung in the air like a promise carved in stone. 45 minutes, 2,700 seconds between life and death, between home and a shallow grave in the Vietnamese highlands. Cole Matthews lowered the radio handset and looked at his men, his brothers in all but blood, fighting in the darkness with a courage that humbled him. "Listen up," he shouted over the gunfire. "We've got reinforcements inbound. Falcon Company 45 minutes out. We hold this position no matter what. You hear me? We hold." The effect was immediate. Backs straightened. Weapons came up with renewed purpose. Even Turner, drifting in his morphine haze, managed a weak thumbs up. Hope, Cole had learned, was a weapon all its own, as potent as any rifle or grenade. But the NVA commander down below had other plans. The second wave hit them at 0200 hours, and it was clear the enemy had committed everything to overwhelming the position before reinforcements could arrive. Automatic weapons fire raked their defensive line from multiple angles. RPG rounds screamed overhead, impacting behind them in eruptions of dirt and shattered stone. And through it all, shadowy figures kept advancing, kept coming, kept dying, but never stopping. "They know," Jack Morrison grunted, firing controlled bursts from his M60 machine gun. The barrel was so hot it glowed faintly in the darkness. "They know help's coming, and they're trying to finish us before it arrives." Cole nodded, not wasting breath on words. Morrison was right. This wasn't a probing attack or a siege anymore. This was an all-out assault, the kind that ended with either complete victory or complete annihilation. A grenade landed 3 meters from Billy Hayes's position. The young private saw it in the light of a muzzle flash, his eyes going wide with recognition and terror. Without thinking, Cole launched himself sideways, his hand snaking out to grab the grenade and hurl it back toward the enemy line. It detonated mid-air, the blast wave slamming into Cole's chest like a mule kick, but it had been far enough away to save Billy's life. "Jesus, Sarge!" Billy's voice cracked with emotion. "You could have—" "Focus on your sector, Private." Cole cut him off, though his hands were shaking now, not from fear but from the aftershock of how close death had come, how close it always was, just waiting for the slightest mistake, the smallest moment of inattention. To their east, Thomas Reeve was fighting his own private war. The demolitions expert had rigged the approach with hastily placed claymore mines, and now he methodically detonated them as enemy soldiers pushed forward. Each explosion carved bloody gaps in the advancing lines, but there were always more to fill those gaps, always more shadows flowing up the hillside like a dark tide. "Last claymore!" Reeve shouted. "After this, it's just small arms." Cole checked his ammunition. 2 magazines left, 60 rounds. He looked around at his men and saw the same calculation happening in every exhausted face. They were running out of everything. Bullets, explosives, time, luck. "Make every shot count," he ordered. "Controlled fire. Pick your targets. Don't waste ammunition on suppression. Go for kills." It went against every instinct of volume of fire tactics, but they had no choice. Every round had to matter now. Every trigger pull had to end a threat. Charlie Brooks, the quiet kid from Montana who wrote poetry in his spare time, fought with a precision that belied his artistic nature. He'd been a competitive shooter before the draft, and now that skill kept them alive. His rifle cracked methodically, crack, 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 and with each shot, an enemy soldier fell. No wasted ammunition, no panic firing, just cold, mechanical lethality. Beside him, Frank Donovan wasn't as skilled a marksman, but he made up for it with sheer stubborn ferocity. The mechanic from Detroit fought like a man possessed, changing magazines with practiced speed, maintaining a rate of fire that kept the enemy from gaining the eastern approach. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. At 02:15, the inevitable happened. An enemy soldier made it to the perimeter, emerging from the darkness with a bayonet fixed to his AK-47. He went straight for Eddie Lane, who was still trying to fight despite his wounded shoulder. The NVA soldier lunged, and Eddie, moving on instinct despite his injury, managed to deflect the bayonet thrust with his rifle barrel. The two men grappled in the dirt, Eddie's wounded shoulder screaming in protest. The enemy soldier was younger, stronger, uninjured. He forced Eddie onto his back, raising his rifle for a killing stroke. And then Hank Carter was there, the wounded medic moving with speed that defied his injury. Hank slammed into the enemy soldier from the side, bearing him to the ground. They rolled in the darkness, a confusion of limbs and grunts, and the wet sounds of a knife finding flesh. When they separated, the NVA soldier stayed down, and Hank crawled back to cover, adding the enemy's knife to his own belt without a word. "Thanks," Eddie gasped, clutching his shoulder where the struggle had reopened the wound. Hank just nodded, his face pale with blood loss, but his hands still steady. "We're all going home, all of us." Cole's radio crackled to life. "Delta 2-3, Falcon 1-6. We're 20 minutes out. I hear heavy contact. What's your status?" 20 minutes. Still an eternity. Cole keyed the handset. "Status is critical. We're almost out of ammunition and the enemy is at the perimeter. We need air support. Anything you can give us." "Roger, working on it. Stand by." Stand by. As if they had any choice. The firefight reached a crescendo of violence that Cole had rarely witnessed even in 18 months of combat. The NVA were throwing everything at them now, accepting horrific casualties in their determination to wipe out the American position before reinforcements arrived. Bodies littered the hillside, some moving, some still, all of them testaments to the terrible cost of this forgotten battle in a war that was supposed to be over. Cole's rifle ran dry. He dropped the empty magazine, reached for his last one, and felt his heart sink. This was it. 30 rounds left. After that, he'd be down to his sidearm and whatever weapons he could scavenge from the dead. "Sarge!" Billy Hayes was waving frantically. "I'm out! I'm completely out! Here!" Morrison tossed a magazine across the position. "That's my last spare." They were cannibalizing their own ammunition supply now, redistributing what little remained to the men in the most threatened positions. It was a losing game, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, but it bought them seconds, and seconds were all they had. At 0230, a new sound cut through the cacophony of battle. A distant thump, thump, thump that Cole recognized instantly, a sound that triggered an almost Pavlovian response of relief and hope. "Choppers!" Jack Morrison shouted. "I hear choppers." Two Huey gunships materialized from the darkness, like avenging angels, their running lights blazing. The lead aircraft's door gunner opened up with his M60, tracers reaching down like fingers of fire to rake the enemy positions. The second bird unleashed a salvo of rockets that turned the hillside below into a hellscape of explosions and flying debris. The effect on the NVA assault was immediate and devastating. Men who'd been pushing forward moments before now broke and ran, seeking cover from the aerial onslaught. The relentless pressure on Cole's position eased, then stopped entirely as the enemy melted back into the jungle. "Falcon 1-6 to Delta 2-3. That's the best I could do on short notice. We're 10 minutes out now. Sit tight." "Roger, Falcon. And thank you." Cole's voice was rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. The gunships continued to circle, the door gunners firing at any movement below. It wasn't a complete reprieve. The enemy was still out there, regrouping, planning. But it gave Cole's exhausted men a chance to breathe, to tend their wounds, to hope they might actually survive this night. Billy Hayes slumped against the rocky wall of their position, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't light the cigarette he'd pulled from his pocket. Cole took the lighter from him, sparked it, and held the flame steady. "You did good, Billy," Cole said quietly. "Real good." The kid inhaled deeply, then coughed. "I was so scared, Sarge. The whole time, I was terrified. Only fools aren't scared in combat. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alive." Cole looked at the young private's face, seeing his own exhaustion and terror reflected there. "You held your position. You kept fighting when it would have been easier to break. That's courage, Billy. Not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. Around them, the other men were taking stock. Hank Carter was working on his own wound, and Turner's simultaneously, his movements slowed by blood loss, but still professional. Eddie Lane had managed to get his shoulder bandaged properly. Morrison, Brooks, Donovan, and Reeve were redistributing what little ammunition remained, making sure every man had at least something to fight with if the enemy came again. "How much we got left?" Cole asked. Morrison's count was grim. "Maybe 200 rounds total for all our rifles. I've got half a belt for the 60. No grenades, no claymores, no rockets. If they hit us again before Falcon arrives..." He didn't need to finish. They all knew what it meant. At 0240, the sound of American voices calling out authentication codes drifted up from the darkness below. Cole grabbed the handset. "Falcon 1-6, Delta 2-3. I've got friendlies approaching from the north. Confirm that's your people." "Confirmed, Delta. That's us. Hold your fire." Lieutenant Rick Kane emerged from the tree line like something from a dream, leading a full platoon of 1st Cavalry soldiers who spread out with professional efficiency to secure the perimeter. Kane himself was tall, square-jawed, and moved with the confident stride of a man who'd never doubted his ability to handle whatever situation arose. The kind of officer who inspired loyalty through competence, rather than rank. He took one look at Cole's decimated position and let out a low whistle. "Jesus Christ, Sergeant. What did you run into? Reinforced platoon at least. Maybe company strength." Cole's voice was hoarse from shouting orders over gunfire. "They had us dead to rights until your gunships showed up." Kane nodded, his expression serious. "We've got medevac inbound for your wounded, 5 minutes out. Let's get them ready to move." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Kane's medics took over care of Turner, Eddie, and Hank, starting IVs and preparing them for evacuation. Kane's radio man coordinated with the incoming helicopter. Kane himself moved among Cole's men, checking on each one, offering words of encouragement that seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. The medevac bird came in hot and fast, touching down just long enough to load the 3 wounded men aboard before clawing its way back into the sky. Cole watched it go, feeling something loosen in his chest. They'd made it. Against all odds, despite everything, they'd made it. "What about you and your men?" Kane asked. "You're beat to hell, Sergeant. You should evac, too." Cole shook his head. "We can still fight. If you're staying, we're staying." Kane studied him for a long moment, then nodded with something like respect. "All right. We're pulling back to a better defensive position about a click east. Valley's too hot to stay here. Can your men move?" "We'll move." They displaced under cover of darkness, Kane's fresh platoon forming a protective cordon around Cole's exhausted survivors. The NVA were still out there somewhere, licking their wounds, but they'd lost their chance. With a full American platoon dug in and helicopter support on call, any further assault would be suicide. The new position was in a bombed-out village that offered better fields of fire and more defensible structures. Kane's men set up a proper perimeter with overlapping sectors and fallback positions. For the first time in what felt like days, Cole allowed himself to believe they might actually see sunrise. Billy Hayes found him as he was checking his rifle one more time, a habit so ingrained he did it without thinking. The young private's face was smudged with dirt and powder residue, his eyes haunted by what he'd seen. But there was something else there, too. Something harder, older. "Sarge, I just wanted to say, what you did back there with the grenade." Billy's voice caught. "You saved my life." "That's the job, Billy." "No, it's not. The job is leading, tactics, strategy." "What you did was..." He struggled for words. "You could have died. For me. Why?" Cole looked at the young man, seeing not just a soldier, but someone's son, someone's friend, someone with decades of life ahead of him if he could just survive this war. "Because every life matters, Billy. Yours, mine, all of us. We don't leave anyone behind." And we don't let anyone die if we can help it. That's not weakness. That's what makes us different from them. Billy nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Cole shook it, feeling the strength in the kid's grip, the resolve that hadn't been there a few hours ago. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Cole Matthews stood on the perimeter and looked out over the valley. Somewhere down there were the men they'd killed, the enemy soldiers who'd died trying to kill them. Young men, probably, with families and dreams and lives cut short by this endless, pointless war. Rick Kane joined him, offering a cigarette that Cole accepted gratefully. They smoked in silence for a while, watching the sun rise over a land that had drunk so much blood. "War's supposed to be over," Kane said finally. "Peace accords signed, withdrawal ongoing. But nobody told these guys." He gestured toward the valley. "They're still fighting like it matters." "Maybe it does. To them." Cole exhaled smoke. "We were on their land after all. That's a dangerous way to think, Sergeant." "Maybe, but it's true." Kane was quiet for a moment. "Command's gonna want a full debrief. This engagement, and it's going to raise questions. We're not supposed to be running combat operations anymore." "We were just trying to get home, Lieutenant. They're the ones who had other ideas." "I know, but the brass..." Kane shook his head. "Politics, always politics. Just be ready for it." Cole thought about his wife, his daughters, the life waiting for him back in Kansas. He thought about Turner, Eddie, and Hank, wounded but alive and heading for hospitals. He thought about Morrison, Brooks, Donovan, Reeve, Billy, all of them exhausted, traumatized, but still breathing. "I'm ready for whatever comes," he said. "As long as my men make it home, that's all that matters." The sun continued its climb, burning away the morning mist, revealing the full scope of the battlefield. Bodies scattered across the hillside, scorched earth, spent brass glinting like fallen stars. The debris of combat, of survival, of that thin line between duty and death. Cole Matthews had stood on that line and held it, and in doing so, he'd earned one more day, one more chance to see home again. But the war, he knew, wasn't done with them yet. The bombed-out village that served as their new defensive position had once been home to maybe 50 families. Now it was just ruins, collapsed walls, shattered roof tiles, and the ghosts of lives interrupted. Cole Matthews sat on what remained of a stone wall, methodically cleaning his rifle despite the exhaustion that made his hands shake. Around him, Kane's platoon and his own surviving men formed a strange amalgamation of fresh troops and combat veterans, the difference between them as stark as the difference between steel and iron tested in fire. The morning sun was fully up now, heating the jungle air into a thick soup of humidity that made breathing feel like work. Cole's uniform was stiff with dried sweat and blood, some his own from minor cuts and scrapes, most of it from carrying wounded men. His body ached in ways that made 32 feel like 50, each movement a reminder of the night's violence. "Sarge, you should eat something." Jack Morrison appeared with an MRE packet, his own exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes. The Boston native had fought like a demon during the night's battle, his M60 machine gun almost single-handedly holding the western approach. Now he moved like an old man, every muscle screaming protest. Cole took the packet without enthusiasm. Chicken and rice, according to the label, though it would taste like cardboard regardless. "You eat yet?" "Forcing myself." Morrison settled onto the wall beside him. "Can't remember the last time I was this tired. Feel like I could sleep for a week. You tentar novamental continuar and me both." Cole forced himself to take a bite, chewing mechanically. His body needed fuel even if his mind couldn't muster any appetite. "How are the others holding up?" "Billy's crashed hard. Kid's out cold against a wall over there." Morrison gestured with his chin. "Brooks and Donovan are on watch rotation with Kane's guys. Reeves checking over what's left of our equipment. We're down to basically nothing, Cole. If we have to fight again, we won't." Cole said it with more confidence than he felt. "Kane's got air support on standby, and a whole platoon. Nobody's going to hit this position." "You don't believe that any more than I do." Morrison was right, as usual. The NVA weren't stupid. They'd taken horrific casualties in the night assault, but they'd also proven they were still willing to fight despite the peace accords. And somewhere out there, a commander was making calculations about acceptable losses versus strategic gains. Lieutenant Kane approached, his face serious. "Sergeant Matthews, I need you and your senior men for a briefing. 10 minutes. In the main structure." "Yes, sir." When Morrison and Cole gathered with Charlie Brooks, Frank Donovan, and Thomas Reeve in what had once been the village's central building, they found Kane standing over a map spread across a makeshift table. His radio man, a fresh-faced corporal named James Harlan, stood nearby with a field radio crackling with occasional transmissions. "Here's the situation," Kane began without preamble. "Command wants us to hold this position for another 12 hours. By then, a full company will arrive to establish a permanent firebase. After that, you and your men will be extracted for debriefing and reassignment." 12 hours. Morrison shook his head. "Sir, with respect, we barely held for 2. Now you want us to stay here where every NVA soldier in the province knows exactly where we are?" "I understand your concern, Corporal. That's why I'm reinforcing the perimeter and keeping air support on standby. We've got 2 gunships that can be here in under 5 minutes, and artillery support from Firebase Jackson if needed." Cole studied the map, noting their position relative to known enemy strongholds. They were deep in what had been contested territory, far from any established American presence. "Lieutenant, why 12 hours? Why not extract us now and bring in the full company fresh?" Kane hesitated, and in that hesitation, Cole saw the truth. Politics. Always politics. "Off the record?" Kane asked. "Off the record," Cole confirmed. "Command is scrambling to explain last night's engagement. According to the peace accords, we're not supposed to be conducting offensive operations." "Your patrol was supposed to be a simple recon, in and out, no contact. Instead, we've got a major firefight with significant enemy casualties. The brass needs time to craft the narrative, get the story straight before questions start getting asked in Washington." "So we're stuck here, so some general can write a better report?" Frank Donovan's voice was bitter. "That's what you're telling us." "I'm telling you the reality of the situation." Kane met his eyes steadily. "I don't like it any more than you do, but those are our orders. We hold for 12 hours. Then you go home." Home. That word again, dangling just out of reach like a mirage in the desert. "What's the intel on enemy forces?" Cole asked, forcing himself to focus on what he could control. "Mixed. The NVA unit that hit you last night took heavy casualties. We estimate 30 to 40 KIA, maybe twice that wounded. But there are other units in the area, and they're not happy about last night's losses. We've got reports of movement to the north and west, possibly battalion strength." Battalion strength. That was 600 to 800 men against Kane's platoon of 40 and Cole's 5 survivors. The math was ugly, no matter how you calculated it. "Air support," Cole said. "You mentioned it twice. How reliable is that commitment?" Kane's expression was answer enough. "The weather's changing. We've got a storm system moving in from the coast. By tonight, visibility might be 0, and the ceiling could drop too low for effective air operations. So we're on our own." Thomas Reeve spoke for the first time, his voice flat. The demolitions expert was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was usually to state uncomfortable truths. Not entirely. Artillery support will still be available regardless of weather. And like I said, a full company is inbound. We just need to hold. The briefing broke up with nothing resolved because nothing could be resolved. They were pieces on a board, moved by players far away who would never face the consequences of their decisions. It was the fundamental reality of military life, and every man in that room had long ago made peace with it. Outside, the heat continued to build. Cole found Billy Hayes awake now. sitting with his back against a wall and staring at nothing. The young private's hands trembled slightly as he tried to light a cigarette, the lighter clicking repeatedly without catching. Cole sat down beside him, took the lighter, and sparked it on the first try. Billy leaned in, got his smoke lit, then exhaled shakily. "Thanks, Sarge." They sat in silence for a while, watching Kane's men strengthen the perimeter. Sandbags being filled and stacked, fields of fire being cleared, tripwires being strung. The familiar rituals of defensive preparation, done with the knowledge that preparation might not be enough. "I killed a man last night," Billy said finally. "Maybe more than one. It's hard to remember exactly, but I know I did. I saw him go down." Cole nodded, waiting. This conversation came to every soldier eventually, usually in the quiet moments after the adrenaline faded and the reality of what they'd done settled in. "He was young, maybe younger than me. I saw his face for just a second before—" Billy's voice cracked. "Before I pulled the trigger, and I keep seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, there he is." "It doesn't get easier," Cole said quietly. "Anyone who tells you it does is lying. You'll carry that face with you for the rest of your life. But Billy, listen to me. You did what you had to do to survive, to protect your brothers. That man was trying to kill you, kill all of us. What you did was necessary. Does that make it right?" "I don't know if right and wrong matter much in combat. There's just alive and dead, and you chose to stay alive. That's not something to be ashamed of." Billy was quiet for a long moment. "My mom, she doesn't even know I'm here. She thinks I'm doing support work in Saigon. I couldn't tell her the truth. How do I go home and tell her what I've done? What I've become?" Cole thought about his own wife, his daughters. He'd stopped writing detailed letters months ago, couldn't bring himself to describe the reality of this war to the people he loved. How did you explain that you'd become intimate with death? That you could kill with the same casual efficiency you once used to fix a tractor or grade papers? You tell her what you need to tell her, Billy. Or you don't tell her anything, but you go home and you live your life and you try to be the man she raised you to be. That's how you honor what you've been through, not by forgetting, but by living. The conversation was interrupted by Corporal Harlan's urgent voice. "Lieutenant, we've got movement on the North Ridge!" Everyone scrambled to positions, weapons coming up, safeties clicking off. Cole grabbed his binoculars and scanned the ridgeline roughly 800 meters away. There, figures moving through the sparse vegetation, not bothering to conceal themselves. "I count 20, Kane said, his own binoculars trained on the ridge. "No, 30. They're just watching us." "Reconnaissance," Cole said. "They're assessing our strength, looking for weaknesses." "Should we engage?" one of Kane's sergeants asked. "Negative. Let them look. The more they see our numbers, the more they might think twice about hitting us." Kane lowered his binoculars. "But everyone stay sharp. This is just the opening act." The enemy observers remained on the ridge for 20 minutes, clearly visible, making no attempt to hide. It was a psychological tactic, Cole knew, letting the defenders see their watchers, knowing they were being studied like specimens in a jar, building tension, fraying nerves. When the observers finally melted back into the jungle, the relief was palpable but temporary. Everyone knew they'd be back, and next time it wouldn't be just to watch. The afternoon dragged by with excruciating slowness. The heat became oppressive, driving men to seek shade where they could find it. The promised storm system was clearly approaching. The sky to the east had taken on a bruised purple color, and the air felt charged with electricity. Cole tried to rest but found sleep impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the night's battle replaying in loops, muzzle flashes in the darkness, the arc of the grenade he'd thrown, the faces of enemy soldiers falling under his rifle sights. The weight of command, of being responsible for the lives of men who trusted him to keep them alive, sat heavy on his shoulders. Around 1500 hours, Charlie Brooks approached with his poetry notebook tucked under his arm. The quiet soldier from Montana had barely spoken since the ambush, but now he settled down next to Cole with a thoughtful expression. "I wrote something," Charlie said, opening the notebook, "about last night. Would you mind if I read it to you?" Cole nodded, surprised. Charlie had never shared his poetry before, keeping it private like a secret garden. Charlie's voice was soft as he read, "In the valley of shadows where young men bleed, we plant our flag on ground we'll never own. The fog remembers every desperate deed and carries home the prayers of the alone. We count our rounds like misers count their gold, each bullet precious as a beating heart. The night grows teeth, the darkness turning cold, and brothers fall apart. But in the gray before the morning comes, when all our courage hangs by threads of will, we find that we are more than war drums. We're men who choose to stand, to hold, to kill, not for the glory, not for nation's pride, but for the man who's bleeding at our side." The silence after Charlie finished was heavy with unspoken emotion. Cole found his throat tight, his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. That's good, Charlie. Really good." "I wanted to capture it," Charlie said quietly. "What it means, why we do this. Because someday, when we're old men and people ask us about the war, I want to remember that it meant something, that we meant something." "We do," Cole said firmly. "Whatever happens, whatever they write in the history books, we mattered, each one of us." At 1600 hours, the storm hit with tropical fury. Rain came down in sheets, reducing visibility to a few meters. Thunder rolled across the valley like artillery, and lightning illuminated the ruins in stark flashes of white light. The defensive position turned into a muddy quagmire within minutes, soldiers slipping and cursing as they tried to maintain their positions. "Could be a blessing," Morrison shouted over the storm's roar. "Can't attack what you can't see." But Cole wasn't so sure. The NVA had proven they were comfortable operating in conditions that would paralyze a less experienced force. The storm could just as easily be cover for an assault. His instincts proved correct at 1700 hours. They came through the rain like ghosts, using the storm's noise to mask their approach. The first indication of attack was a tripwire detonating on the southern perimeter, followed immediately by a volley of RPG rounds that streaked through the rain like angry meteors. "Contact south!" The call went up, and suddenly the ruins erupted into chaos again. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness of the storm, tracers drawing lines through the rain, men shouting coordinates and targets barely visible through the downpour. Cole found himself fighting in conditions that turned modern warfare into something primal and desperate. Visibility was so poor that enemies appeared as shadows, shapes moving through curtains of rain. His rifle felt slick in his hands, water running into his eyes, the ground beneath his feet more mud than earth. An enemy soldier materialized 5 meters away, bringing his AK-47 to bear. Cole fired first, 3 rapid shots, and the man went down. Another appeared to his left, and Billy Hayes shot him. They were fighting at ranges where they could see the whites of enemy eyes, where combat became personal and immediate. "They're flanking west," Kane's voice cut through the storm. "Shift fire west." The battle devolved into a confused melee, with lines blurring and soldiers from both sides mixing together in the ruins. Cole found himself fighting hand-to-hand with an NVA soldier, both of them slipping in the mud, grappling for advantage. The enemy soldier got his hands around Cole's throat, squeezing, and Cole drove his knee up hard, breaking the hold. His combat knife found the man's ribs once, twice, and the soldier collapsed. No time to process, no time to feel. Another enemy soldier was charging Frank Donovan's position from behind. Cole shot him, shifted targets, fired again. The world had contracted to a bubble of violence maybe 30 meters across, where the only imperative was kill or be killed. Thomas Reeve emerged from the main building, carrying what looked like a satchel charge. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward a cluster of enemy soldiers trying to breach the eastern wall. "Fire in the hole!" he screamed, and threw the charge. The explosion was massive, turning that entire section of the perimeter into a crater. But there were so many of them. Despite the storm, despite the defenders' desperation, the NVA kept coming. They'd committed fully to this assault, accepting casualties that would have broken a less determined force. "We can't hold!" Morrison's voice was nearly lost in the storm. "There's too many!" He was right. Cole could see it happening, the perimeter contracting, men falling back toward the central building, the defensive line crumbling under relentless pressure. In minutes, maybe seconds, they'd be overrun. Then the sky split open with a different kind of thunder. Despite the storm, despite the impossible conditions, the gunships came. Two Hueys diving through the rain like avenging angels, their door gunners opening up with reckless abandon. The miniguns screamed, tracers reaching down to tear through enemy positions with devastating effect. The impact on the NVA assault was immediate. Men who'd been pressing forward suddenly broke, seeking any cover from the aerial onslaught. The gunships made repeated passes, their pilots pushing the limits of safety to support the ground forces below. "Artillery inbound!" Harlan shouted. 30 seconds! Get down!" The first salvo from Fire Base Jackson landed 200 meters out, walking a line of explosions across the enemy's suspected rally point. The second salvo was closer, danger close. Close enough that Cole felt the concussive force in his chest. But it was working. The enemy assault was faltering, breaking, routing. By 1800 hours, the storm was beginning to pass, and the enemy was in full retreat. Bodies littered the ruins, most of them NVA, but too many American as well. Kane's platoon had taken casualties. 3 dead that Cole could see, maybe twice that wounded. Cole did a head count of his own men. Morrison, check. Brooks, check. Donovan limping but alive, check. Reeve, check. Billy Hayes, sitting in the mud with a dazed expression but breathing, check. They'd held. Again. Against odds that should have killed them all, they'd held. Lieutenant Kane found Cole as the last of the rain tapered off. The officer's face was grim, smudged with powder residue and blood that probably wasn't his own. "That was too close," Kane said simply. "Yeah." Cole's voice was hoarse from shouting. "How long until that company arrives?" Kane checked his watch. 6 hours, maybe 7. We've got to make it until midnight." Cole looked at his exhausted men, at Kane's battered platoon, at the ruins that had become a charnel house. 6 more hours. It might as well have been 6 days. "We'll make it," he said, because what else could he say? But as night fell on the second day, Cole Matthews wondered if he'd finally made a promise he couldn't keep. The ruins reeked of cordite and death as darkness settled over the battlefield for the second night in a row. Cole Matthews moved among his men, checking on each one with the methodical care of a shepherd counting his flock. Every soldier still breathing felt like a small miracle, a middle finger raised at the universe that seemed determined to kill them all. Billy Hayes sat with his back against a bullet-scarred wall, his rifle across his knees and his eyes staring at nothing. The young private had aged a decade in 2 days, the last traces of boyhood burned away in the crucible of combat. When Cole approached, Billy didn't look up. "You hit?" Cole asked, crouching down beside him. "No, Sarge, just tired, so damn tired." Billy's voice was flat, emptied of emotion. "How many more times, you think? How many more times can we beat them back before our luck runs out?" It was the question every man was thinking, but few dared voice. Cole didn't have a good answer because there wasn't one. "We've got 6 hours, that's all." 6 hours, and then a full company arrives and this becomes someone else's problem. "You really believe that?" Cole wanted to say yes, wanted to offer reassurance and confidence. But Billy deserved honesty. "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I know we've made it this far and I'm not giving up now. Neither are you." Across the compound, Jack Morrison was working on his M60 machine gun by flashlight, his thick fingers moving with surprising delicacy as he cleared a jam that had developed during the storm. The weapon had saved their lives multiple times, but it was wearing out, pushed beyond its designed limits. "How's she looking?" Cole asked, settling down beside the Boston native. "Like she's held together with hope and stubbornness. Feed mechanism is damaged, barrel's worn, and I'm down to maybe 200 rounds." Morrison didn't look up from his work. "But she'll fire. That's all that matters." Frank Donovan appeared, carrying a case of ammunition he'd scavenged from Kane's supply. "Found some M60 rounds. Not much, but better than nothing." "You're a beautiful man, Frank." Morrison accepted the ammo with genuine gratitude. "I could kiss you right now." "Buy me dinner first." Donovan's attempt at humor fell flat, but the effort mattered. They were all trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, of humanity, in circumstances designed to strip both away. Lieutenant Kane called another briefing at 2000 hours. This time, the gathered men included not just Cole's survivors, but Kane's squad leaders as well. The toll of the day's fighting was evident on every face: exhaustion, trauma, the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much death. "Current situation," Kane began, his voice tight with stress. "We've got 28 effectives, down from 45 this morning. 3 confirmed KIA, 14 wounded and evacuated. Ammunition is critically low across all weapon systems. The good news is that enemy forces appear to have withdrawn to regroup. The bad news is we've intercepted radio chatter suggesting they're bringing up reinforcements for another push." "When?" one of Kane's sergeants asked. "Best guess, around 2300 hours. They'll want darkness but enough time before dawn to finish us if the first assault fails." Kane looked around the room. "I won't sugarcoat this. If they hit us with battalion strength, we're not going to hold, not with our current numbers and ammunition." "So what's the plan?" Thomas Reeve asked, his quiet voice cutting through the tension. Kane hesitated, and Cole recognized the look of a man about to give orders he knew might get people killed. "We've got 2 options. 1, we stay here and hope the relief force arrives before the enemy does. 2, we abandon this position and move to an alternate extraction point 3 clicks northeast." "Running." Morrison said the word like a curse. "After everything we've been through, you want us to run." "I want us to survive, Corporal." There's no shame in tactical withdrawal when the alternative is annihilation. "What about air support?" Cole asked. "Artillery?" "Fire-Base Jackson is under attack. They're dealing with their own problems and can't guarantee support. Air assets are grounded due to the weather. Visibility is still too poor for safe operations." Kane's expression was grim. "We're on our own." The room erupted in angry voices, men venting frustration and fear. Kane let it go for a moment, understanding the need for release, then raised his hand for silence. "I know this isn't what you want to hear. Believe me, if there was another way, but there isn't. We can't hold this position against a determined assault, not with our current strength. So we move. We move smart. We move quiet. And we live to fight another day." Cole thought about the question Billy had asked earlier. How many more times before their luck ran out? Maybe Kane was right. Maybe survival was worth more than pride. "When do we move?" he asked. 2130 hours. That gives us time to prepare, rig some surprises for anyone who comes after us, and get a head start before they realize we're gone. The decision made, men dispersed to prepare. Cole found Charlie Brooks alone, his poetry notebook open, but the pages blank. The Montana native looked up as Cole approached. "Can't find the words," Charlie said quietly. "Everything I try to write feels inadequate, hollow. Maybe some things are beyond words. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just not good enough to capture it." Charlie closed the notebook with a sigh. "We're really leaving? After all those men died to hold this place?" "Those men died so we could survive, Charlie. Not for a pile of ruins that doesn't mean anything to anyone. Cole sat down beside him. There's no glory in dying for no reason. If we can live to fight another day, that's what we do. My dad was in World War II, Charlie said after a moment. Italy. He used to tell me stories about holding positions against impossible odds, about never retreating, about American soldiers who didn't know how to quit. I grew up thinking that's what courage looked like, standing your ground no matter what. Your dad was in a different war, a war where the lines were clear, where we knew why we were fighting, where holding ground mattered. Cole's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't that war, Charlie. This is something else, something smaller and meaner and harder to understand. And in this war, courage isn't about standing till you die. It's about surviving so you can go home to the people who love you. Charlie nodded slowly, processing. You think we will? Go home? I think we've got a better chance if we're smart than if we're stubborn. At 2100 hours, they began their preparations to withdraw. Thomas Reeve, in his element now, rigged the defensive position with improvised explosives and booby traps. Anyone comes through here is going to have a bad time, he said with grim satisfaction. Morrison positioned his M60 to cover their withdrawal route, planning to be the last man out. Frank Donovan and Charlie Brooks gathered what little ammunition remained, distributing it evenly among the men. Billy Hayes, moving like a man in a dream, checked and rechecked his gear with mechanical precision. Kane's men worked with equal efficiency, having done this before. Claymore mines positioned to cover approaches, tripwires strung at ankle height in likely avenues of advance, small charges set to detonate on timers, creating confusion and chaos for pursuers. Cole watched it all with a mixture of professional admiration and deep sadness. They'd transformed a defensive position into a death trap, and somewhere in the back of his mind he wondered about the men who would trigger those traps. Young soldiers like Billy, probably. Men who'd been drafted or volunteered for reasons they might not even remember. Men who'd die in these ruins because some commander far away had decided this worthless piece of ground was worth bleeding for. But that was the nature of war. Senseless death in service of incomprehensible objectives. At 21:25 hours, as they prepared for final movement, Corporal Harlan's radio crackled to life. Falcon 1-6, this is Falcon Actual. How copy? Kane grabbed the handset. Falcon Actual, this is 1-6, 5x5. 1-6. Be advised the relief force has been delayed. New ETA is 0400 hours. Repeat, 0400 hours. Can you hold? Kane's face went pale. 0400. That was nearly 7 hours an enemy away, that could attack at any moment. Falcon, Actual, what's the cause of delay? Route to your position is interdicted. Relief force is engaging enemy forces along Highway 1. Will advise when situation changes. Falcon Actual out. The radio went dead, and with it, the last of their hope for a clean extraction. Damn it! Kane lowered the handset slowly. Damn it to hell. So we're stuck, Morrison said. Can't stay here. Can't count on relief. What now, Lieutenant? Kane looked at Cole, and in that moment the question of rank became irrelevant. They were just two soldiers trying to keep their men alive. We still move, Cole said before Kane could respond, but not to an extraction point. We find somewhere defensible, somewhere they won't expect, and we go to ground. Hide rather than fight. Survive until dawn, then reassess. Where? Billy Hayes asked. This whole valley is crawling with NVA. Where can we hide? Thomas Reeve spoke up, his finger tracing a route on the map. Here, 2 clicks north-northeast, old French bunker complex from the First Indochina War. Most people have forgotten it exists, but I spotted it on an aerial reconnaissance photo 2 weeks ago. It's overgrown, probably falling apart, but if we can get inside... We'd be trapped if they find us, Kane pointed out. We're trapped anyway, Cole countered. At least there, we'd have walls and cover. And maybe, just maybe, They'll waste time searching the wrong places. Kane studied the map for a long moment, calculating odds that could never be accurately calculated. Finally, he nodded. All right, we move in 10 minutes. Travel light, weapons and ammunition only. Leave everything else. The withdrawal began at 21:30 exactly. They moved in single file through the darkness, Morrison and his M60 holding the rear, Kane's point man leading with night vision goggles. The jungle pressed in from all sides, alive with sounds that might be animals or might be enemy soldiers tracking their movement. Cole positioned himself in the middle of the column, close to Billy Hayes, who seemed to be operating on autopilot. The young private moved mechanically, one foot in front of the other, his eyes unfocused. "Stay with me, Billy," Cole whispered. "Just keep moving. Don't think. Just move." They'd covered maybe half a click when the night behind them erupted in explosions. Reeves' booby traps detonating, meaning the enemy had moved on the ruins faster than anticipated. Voices shouted in Vietnamese, audible even at this distance, and then more explosions as the pursuing force triggered additional traps. "Double time," Kane ordered quietly. "They know we're gone. They'll be coming." The pace picked up, men moving as quickly as stealth allowed. The jungle was treacherous in darkness, roots to trip over, branches to snag on, ravines that appeared without warning. A soldier from Kane's platoon went down with a twisted ankle, and two of his squadmates had to support him between them. They couldn't afford to slow down. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness, voices called out coordinates, and somewhere a whistle blew, a signal, communication between units. "They're tracking us," Morrison panted, appearing beside Cole. "We're leaving a trail a blind man could follow in this mud." He was right. The storm had turned the ground into a quagmire, and 28 men moving through it left obvious signs. The enemy just had to follow the churned earth, and they'd find their quarry eventually. "How much further?" Cole asked. "One click," Reeve answered from ahead. "Maybe less, but we need to lose them or they'll have us pinned down at the bunker." Kane made a quick decision. "Reeve, take 10 men and the wounded soldier. Get to that bunker and secure it. The rest of us will slow down the pursuit, then follow. We'll leapfrog back to your position." It was a dangerous gambit, splitting their already small force. But it was also their only chance. Reeve nodded and selected his men quickly. Donovan, Brooks, Billy Hayes, and 6 of Kane's soldiers, including the one with the twisted ankle. "Cole, you go with them," Kane said. "Make sure they get there safely." "Lieutenant, that's an order, Sergeant. Your men need you more than I do right now." Cole wanted to argue, wanted to stay and fight, but Kane was right. His surviving men needed leadership, needed someone to get them home. He nodded reluctantly and joined Reeves' group. As they moved off into the darkness, Cole heard Kane and Morrison setting up a hasty ambush behind them. The sound of weapons being positioned, quiet voices coordinating fields of fire. And then, horribly, the sounds of contact, rifles barking, grenades detonating, men screaming. "Keep moving," Reeve urged. "Don't look back, just move." Cole forced himself forward, trusting Kane and Morrison to do their jobs while he did his. Around him, his men moved with grim determination. Billy Hayes's face was streaked with tears, though whether from fear or exhaustion, Cole couldn't tell. The old French bunker complex appeared out of the darkness like a fortress from a nightmare. Concrete walls covered in vines and vegetation, firing slits that gaped like empty eye sockets, a heavy metal door that hung half off its hinges. It was a relic from another war, another era, but right now it looked like salvation. "Inside, quick!" Reeve led them through the door into darkness that smelled of rust and rotting vegetation. Flashlights clicked on, revealing a central chamber with corridors branching off in multiple directions. The place was in bad shape, collapsed sections, standing water, evidence of animals, but the main structure was intact. "Secure the entrances," Cole ordered. "Brooks, you and Donovan check those corridors. Make sure there are no surprises. Billy, you're with me." They worked quickly, dragging debris to block the main entrance while leaving firing ports. The wounded soldier with the twisted ankle was positioned in the safest corner. Every man found a position, covering a potential approach. And then they waited. The sounds of fighting from outside grew closer, then seemed to move away. Cole could hear Vietnamese voices, shouting, angry. They were searching, hunting. He imagined Kane and Morrison playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with their pursuers, trying to buy time without getting surrounded. Minutes crawled by like hours. The air in the bunker was stifling, thick with humidity and the smell of fear sweat. Every man held his weapon ready, safeties off, fingers resting lightly on triggers. At 22:45, Kane and the remainder of his force arrived. They came in fast, Morrison practically dragging one of Kane's men who'd taken a round through the calf. The heavy door was pulled shut and barricaded, and suddenly they were entombed in concrete and darkness. "How bad?" Cole asked as Kane caught his breath. "2 more wounded, 1 serious. Lost Corporal Jenkins. Took an RPG blast." Kane's voice was tight. "They're right behind us, maybe 5 minutes out." 5 minutes. Cole looked around at his men. 26 now, 2 dead since morning, exhausted and low on ammunition and trapped in a derelict bunker while an enemy army closed in around them. "Reeve, what do you know about this place?" he asked. The demolitions expert wiped sweat from his face. "Built by the French in the early 50s, part of a defensive line that didn't stop anything. It's got 3 levels. This main floor, a lower level that's probably flooded, and an upper observation post. Multiple entrances, which is bad for defense. But the walls are thick, reinforced concrete. Small arms fire won't penetrate. Escape routes? There's a rear exit on the lower level, opens into a ravine. Might be our way out if we need it." "Check it," Cole ordered. "Make sure it's accessible. Billy, you go with him." As Reeve and Billy disappeared into one of the corridors, the first probing shots rang out against the bunker's walls. Then more, a sustained fusillade that made the ancient concrete shake. They were here. Kane positioned his men at the firing slits, weapons aimed at shadows moving in the jungle beyond. "Hold fire until you've got clear targets. Make every round count." The siege had begun. For the next 3 hours, they fought a desperate defensive action. The enemy probed repeatedly, testing the bunker's defenses, looking for weak points. Each assault was beaten back through carefully controlled fire and the advantage of cover, but ammunition dwindled with every exchange. At 0100 hours, Reeve returned from exploring the lower level, his expression grim. "The rear exit is accessible, but it opens onto a sheer drop, maybe 40 feet down into the ravine. We'd need ropes and we don't have any." "Could we improvise?" Kane asked. "Maybe. With time. But not while we're under attack." So they were truly trapped. No relief force coming until 0400 at the earliest, possibly later. No escape route. Dwindling ammunition and men too exhausted to think straight, let alone fight effectively. Cole found Billy Hayes sitting with his back to the wall, his rifle across his knees, staring at nothing. "Hey, kid, you hanging in there?" Billy looked up slowly, his eyes haunted. "Sarge, I need to tell you something. About my mom, my family, in case we don't make it out. We're going to make it, Billy, but if we don't, please, just listen." And so Cole listened as the young private talked about his mother, a waitress in a small Indiana town, about his younger sister still in high school, about the garage apartment he'd been fixing up before he got drafted, planning to rent it out to save money for Tentar Novamente El Continuar College. About dreams that seemed impossibly distant now, separated by an ocean of blood and an eternity of darkness. "They need to know I tried," Billy said, his voice breaking. "They need to know I didn't run, that I did my duty. Can you promise me that? If you make it and I don't, you'll tell them?" Cole gripped the young man's shoulder. "I promise, Billy. But you're going to tell them yourself. You hear me? You're going home." At 0200 hours, the enemy launched their most determined assault yet. RPG rounds slammed into the bunker's walls, explosive impacts that sent chunks of concrete flying. Automatic weapons fire poured through the firing slits, forcing defenders to duck and cover. And then came the sound Cole had been dreading, the metallic clang of something hitting the bunker's roof. "Satchel charge!" Thomas Reeves screamed. "They're trying to blow through the roof!" Everyone scrambled away from the center of the bunker, pressing against the walls. The explosion, when it came, was enormous. A thunderclap that collapsed part of the ceiling and filled the air with choking dust. When Cole could see again, he found a gaping hole in the roof and enemy soldiers preparing to drop through it. "Covering fire on that hole!" Kane roared, and suddenly every weapon in the bunker was pointing upward, firing at shadows and shapes against the night sky. Bodies fell through the opening. Enemy soldiers cut down before they could land. But more kept coming, desperate and determined. The battle descended into close-quarters chaos. Enemy soldiers dropped into the bunker's main chamber, and suddenly it was hand-to-hand, rifles used as clubs, knives flashing in the darkness. Cole shot a soldier at point-blank range, felt another grab him from behind, drove his elbow back hard, and spun with his rifle stock, connecting with bone. Beside him, Frank Donovan grappled with an enemy soldier, both men locked in a death embrace. Charlie Brooks came up behind the NVA soldier and put his pistol to the man's head, fired once, then had to support Donovan as the mechanic nearly collapsed from exhaustion and shock. Morrison's M60 roared in the confined space, deafeningly loud, cutting down enemy soldiers trying to exploit the breach in the ceiling. The big Boston native stood his ground like an oak tree, immovable, his machine gun sweeping back and forth in controlled bursts. And through it all, Billy Hayes fought with a ferocity that shocked Cole. The young private who'd been trembling and crying hours before now moved with cold efficiency, shooting, reloading, shooting again. Something had broken in him, or maybe something had been forged. Either way, the boy from Indiana was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The assault lasted 15 minutes but felt like hours. When it finally broke, when the last enemy soldier was driven back or killed, the bunker was a charnel house. Bodies sprawled on the concrete floor, American and Vietnamese mixed together in death's democracy. The air was thick with gun smoke and the copper smell of blood. "Casualty report," Kane gasped, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. The count was grim. 4 more of Kane's men were down, 2 dead, 2 wounded. Cole's own people had taken hits as well. Charlie Brooks had a nasty gash across his forehead from a rifle butt. Frank Donovan was limping from a twisted knee. And Morrison... "Sarge, Morrison's hurt bad," Billy called out, his voice tight with panic. Cole rushed over to find the big machine gunner sitting against the wall, his hand pressed to his abdomen where blood was spreading dark and wet. Morrison looked up at Cole and tried to smile. Took a round during the rush. Didn't even feel it at first. His voice was surprisingly steady. "How bad does it look?" Cole pulled Morrison's hand away gently and felt his stomach drop. The wound was serious, maybe mortal. "You're gonna be fine, Jack. Just hang on." "You're a terrible liar, Sarge." Morrison coughed and blood flecked his lips. "But I appreciate the effort." Kane appeared with the last of their medical supplies. Bandages, pressure dressings, morphine. Together, he and Cole worked on Morrison while Billy Hayes held a flashlight steady despite his trembling hands. "How many rounds left for the 60? Morrison asked, his face going pale from blood loss. "Jack, don't worry about that now." "How many?" Cole checked the ammunition box. "Maybe 50, maybe less." Morrison nodded slowly. "Not enough, not nearly enough if they come again." He looked at Cole with eyes that were already starting to glaze. "You need to get everyone out." "The rear exit. Improvise ropes, climb down, whatever it takes. Get out while there's still time." "We're not leaving you, Jack." "Yes, you are." Morrison's voice gained strength, command authority breaking through pain. "That's an order, Sergeant. I'll stay here with the 60, hold them off while you escape." Someone has to buy time, and I'm—" He coughed again. "I'm not making that climb anyway. We both know it." "Jack, don't." Morrison gripped Cole's arm with surprising strength. "Don't make this harder than it is. I'm from Boston, remember? Bunker Hill, Old Ironsides, all that history. We know how to make last stands. Let me do this. Let me mean something." Cole felt tears burning his eyes, tears he'd held back through 2 days of hell but couldn't contain any longer. "You've always meant something, Jack. Always. Then honor that. Get these men home. Tell my wife. Tell Mary that I loved her every day, that she made me better than I deserved to be." Lieutenant Kane pulled Cole aside, his voice low and urgent. "Matthews, he's right. We've got maybe 20 minutes before they regroup for another assault. If we're going to move, it has to be now." Cole looked around the bunker at the exhausted, wounded, terrified men who'd survived this long through a combination of skill, courage, and impossible luck. He looked at Morrison, already positioning himself behind his machine gun, despite the blood soaking through his uniform. He looked at Billy Hayes, at Charlie Brooks, at Frank Donovan, at Thomas Reeve, at all the men who trusted him to lead them home. "All right," he said finally. "We go. Reeve, take point down to the lower level. Kane, organize the withdrawal. You'll go with them," Morrison interrupted. "Now, Cole, go." The retreat down to the bunker's lower level was a nightmare of tight corridors and standing water. The wounded had to be carried, weapons and equipment dragged through spaces barely wide enough for one man. Above them, they could hear Morrison repositioning, the scrape of metal on concrete as he moved his machine gun to cover the approaches. The rear exit was exactly as bad as Reeve had described. A narrow opening that looked out onto a 40-foot drop into a ravine choked with vegetation. In daylight, with proper equipment, it would have been a challenge. In darkness, exhausted, with wounded men to evacuate, it seemed impossible. "We can tie our slings together," Reeve said, already working on the improvised rope. "Won't be strong enough for everyone, but we can use it to control descent, maybe rig a harness for the wounded." They worked frantically, knowing every second counted. Above them, the sound of renewed firing, Morrison's M60 barking defiance at an enemy that had returned. The distinctive rhythm of the machine gun was punctuated by explosions and the crack of rifles. "He's holding them," Kane said quietly, "giving us time." The first group rappelled down the improvised rope, Reeve and 2 of Kane's men who'd established security at the bottom. Then the wounded, lowered in makeshift harnesses that would have made any safety inspector weep. Every man who went down was one step closer to survival. Cole waited until last, along with Kane, Billy Hayes, and Charlie Brooks. Above them, Morrison's fire had become sporadic, conserving ammunition, or running out. Cole tried not to think about which. "Your turn, Sergeant," Kane said, gesturing to the rope. "I'll bring up the rear." Cole started to protest, but Kane's expression brooked no argument. "Your men need you more than mine need me. Go." Cole gripped the makeshift rope, took one last look at the corridor leading back up to the main level, to where Morrison fought his last battle. Then he rappelled down into darkness. The descent was controlled chaos. Hands grabbed him at the bottom, pulling him clear so others could follow. Billy came next, then Charlie. Kane was the last, dropping the final few feet when the rope finally gave way under cumulative stress. "Move out," Kane ordered. "Northeast toward the extraction coordinates. Double time." They ran through the ravine, stumbling over rocks and roots, driven by adrenaline and the knowledge that Morrison's sacrifice had bought them minutes, not hours. Behind them, the machine gun fire stuttered, paused, then resumed. Morrison was still fighting. Then the firing stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, from far behind them, a single massive explosion that lit up the night sky. Morrison had set off something, grenades maybe, or remaining explosives. One final act of defiance. Billy Hayes stopped running, turned back toward the bunker they couldn't see anymore. "He's gone," Morrison's gone. Keep moving, Private. Cole's voice was harsh, driven by grief and the desperate need to make Morrison's sacrifice mean something. We honor him by surviving. Now move. They ran through the remainder of the night, a desperate exodus through enemy territory. Every shadow was a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of pursuit. The wounded slowed them down, but no one suggested leaving them behind. They'd made it this far together, and they'd finish together or not at all. At 0330, they heard it, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. The relief force was inbound finally, bringing with it the promise of extraction and safety. Kane got on the radio, coordinating, broadcasting their position. Falcon Actual, this is Falcon 1-6. We're 2 clicks south of primary extraction point. Multiple wounded need immediate evac. How copy? 1-6. Falcon Actual. We have your position. Gunships inbound to secure LZ. Slicks 30 seconds behind. Pop smoke when you're ready. Cole pulled the smoke grenade from his vest, the last piece of equipment he'd carried through hell. When they reached a clearing large enough for a helicopter landing, he pulled the pin and threw it. Purple smoke billowed into the dawn sky. The gunships arrived first, circling the clearing like protective birds of prey. Then the transport helicopters, Hueys that settled onto the ground with their rotors still turning. The most beautiful sight Cole Matthews had ever seen. "Everyone on!" Kane shouted. "Wounded first! Move, move, move!" They loaded quickly, efficiently, men who'd spent 2 days fighting for their lives now fighting to escape. Cole made sure every one of his men was aboard before he climbed on himself. Billy Hayes, Charlie Brooks, Frank Donovan, Thomas Reeve, all accounted for, all still breathing. As the helicopter lifted off, Cole looked back at the jungle that had tried so hard to kill them. Somewhere back there, Jack Morrison's body lay in a ruined French bunker, along with too many others who'd never go home. Somewhere back there, the war continued, indifferent to peace accords and political promises. But they'd survived. Against impossible odds, against an enemy that should have wiped them out, they'd survived. And as the helicopter carried them toward safety, Cole Matthews allowed himself to believe, for the first time in 2 days, that he might actually see Kansas again. The medical facility at Da Nang Air Base was organized chaos, wounded men being triaged, doctors and nurses moving with practiced efficiency, the constant thrum of generators powering equipment that kept soldiers alive. Cole Matthews sat on an examination table while a young Army doctor cleaned the various cuts and scrapes he'd accumulated over 2 days of combat. "You're lucky," the doctor said, applying antiseptic that stung like fire. "Most of these are superficial. You'll be sore for a week, but nothing permanent." Lucky. Cole almost laughed at the word. He didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, emptied out, like someone had scooped away everything inside him and left only a shell. Around him, other survivors from the patrol and Kane's platoon were receiving similar treatment, their faces bearing the same 1,000-yard stare. Billy Hayes sat 3 beds over, a nurse wrapping his hands where blisters from the improvised rope had torn his palms raw. The young private stared at nothing, responding to questions with monosyllabic answers. Charlie Brooks was getting stitches for the gash on his forehead, his poetry notebook clutched in his other hand like a talisman. Frank Donovan's knee was being examined, the doctor muttering about potential ligament damage. Lieutenant Rick Kane stood near the entrance, arguing with a Major Cole didn't recognize. The conversation was heated, Kane's body language aggressive despite the difference in rank. "Don't care what your orders are, Major. These men have been through hell. They need rest, not debriefing. That's not your call to make, Lieutenant. Command wants a full report on the engagement, and they want it now. 2 days of unauthorized combat operations while peace accords are in effect? This is a political nightmare." "Political nightmare?" Kane's voice rose. "Tell that to the men who died. Tell that to Corporal Morrison, who held off an enemy assault so his friends could escape. Tell that to—" "Lieutenant, You're out of line. Stand down." Kane looked like he wanted to say more, but he clamped his jaw shut and nodded stiffly. The major turned and left, his polished boots clicking on the tile floor in sharp contrast to the muddy, blood-stained boots worn by the men he'd come to interrogate. A clerk appeared at Cole's side, clipboard in hand. "Sergeant Matthews? Colonel Patterson wants to see you in conference room 3, now." Cole slid off the examination table, ignoring the doctor's protest that he wasn't finished. The walk through the facility's corridors felt surreal. Clean walls, fluorescent lighting, the smell of disinfectant instead of cordite and death. It was like stepping into another world, one that existed parallel to but entirely separate from the reality he'd just survived. Conference room 3 held 4 men. Colonel Patterson, a hard-faced career officer with Vietnam ribbons dating back to 1965, a major from intelligence, a captain from public affairs, and a civilian in a rumpled suit who screamed CIA or State Department. "Sergeant Matthews, sit down." Patterson's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Cole sat, feeling underdressed in his dirty uniform, aware of how he must smell after 2 days without bathing. "I've read Lieutenant Kane's preliminary report," Patterson began. 8-man patrol ambushed, sustained combat operations over 48 hours, multiple casualties. Before we get into details, I need to understand one thing. Why were you operating in that sector? Your orders were to recon Route 7, then extract. The engagement site was 20 clicks from your assigned area. Cole chose his words carefully. "We were compromised en route to extraction. Took fire from a superior force. We withdrew to defensible terrain and called for support. And then decided to hold that terrain for 2 days instead of continuing to withdraw. We had wounded, sir. We couldn't move fast enough to evade pursuit. We made the tactical decision to defend and wait for relief." The intelligence major leaned forward. "Sergeant, we've got reports from signal intercepts suggesting the NVA unit you engaged was a reinforced company, possibly battalion strength. That's 400 to 800 men. You're telling me 8 Americans held off that many enemy soldiers?" "With respect, Major, Lieutenant Kane's platoon arrived approximately 8 hours into the engagement. After that, we had maybe 35 effectives. Still impressive odds, or improbable, depending on how you look at it." The major's tone suggested he was leaning toward improbable. "We need details, Sergeant. Exact timeline, enemy dispositions, ammunition expenditure, everything." For the next 3 hours, Cole recounted the engagement in exhaustive detail. He described the initial ambush, the fighting withdrawal, the defensive positions. He talked about Morrison's machine gun holding the western approach, about Reeves' booby traps, about Billy Hayes fighting with desperate courage despite his fear. He described the decision to withdraw to the bunker, the siege, Morrison's last stand. Through it all, the officers took notes, asked questions, probed for inconsistencies. The civilians said nothing, just watched Cole with eyes that missed nothing. When Cole finally finished, his throat was raw and his hands were shaking from reliving it all. Patterson closed his notebook and leaned back. "Sergeant, this engagement presents us with a significant problem. The Paris Peace Accords explicitly forbid offensive operations. The American people believe this war is over. If word gets out that we're still conducting combat patrols, still taking casualties..." He let the sentence hang. "With respect, sir, we didn't start that fight. We were just trying to get home." "I understand that. And officially, that's what our report will say. Your patrol was conducting final withdrawal operations when you were attacked. You defended yourselves and waited for relief. All perfectly legitimate under the rules of engagement. The public affairs captain spoke up for the first time. The medals will help. Silver stars for you and Lieutenant Kane. Bronze stars with V device for the rest of your surviving men. Purple hearts for the wounded. And," he paused, "Corporal Morrison will receive the Medal of Honor, posthumously. His actions buying time for the others to escape, That's exactly the kind of heroism the American people need to hear about. Cole felt sick. They were going to turn Morrison's death into propaganda, package his sacrifice in a neat bow for public consumption. It felt wrong, disrespectful, even though he knew Jack would have been honored by the recognition. "What about the men who died?" Cole asked. "Jenkins and the others from Kane's platoon? What about them?" "They'll be honored as well," Patterson said. "But Matthews, you need to understand something. This engagement, as heroic as it was, is also an embarrassment. A reminder that we're not out of this war yet, that our boys are still dying even after the peace accords. So we're going to acknowledge the sacrifice, honor the heroes, and then move on. Quietly. Do you understand?" Cole understood. They were going to bury this story as quickly as they could, minimize the political damage, sweep the uncomfortable truths under the rug of official reports and classified documents. "What happens to me and my men now?" "You'll remain in country for another week for final debriefing and administrative processing. Then you're going home, all of you. Consider this your last mission in Vietnam. Going home." The words should have brought relief, joy, hope. Instead, Cole felt only numbness. How could he go home when Morrison was dead? When men he'd led into combat weren't coming back? How could he walk into his house in Kansas, hug his wife and daughters, and pretend everything was normal when part of him was still in that bunker, still fighting, still dying? The meeting broke up, and Cole was escorted back to the medical facility. On the way, he passed a wall covered in photographs, men who died in Vietnam, their service photos arranged in neat rows. Soon, Morrison's face would join them, just another young man who'd given everything for a war that was supposed to be over. He found his surviving men gathered in a day room, trying to process what they'd been through. Billy Hayes sat apart from the others, staring out a window. Charlie Brooks was writing furiously in his notebook, transcribing memories before they faded. Frank Donovan and Thomas Reeve played cards with mechanical precision, going through motions without any real engagement. "How'd it go with the brass?" Charlie asked when Cole entered. "About how you'd expect. They're giving us medals and sending us home, and they're giving Morrison the Medal of Honor." The room went silent. Finally, Billy spoke without turning from the window. "He deserves it. He saved us all." "Yeah, he did." Cole sat down heavily. He and too many others. They sat together in silence, these men who'd shared something most people would never understand. Not the glory of war that movies depicted, but the reality. Fear, exhaustion, the desperate struggle to survive, the guilt of living when others died. Over the next week, Cole went through the motions of out-processing. He submitted to more debriefings, filled out more forms, endured more medical examinations. He wrote letters to Morrison's widow, to the families of the other men who'd died. Every word felt inadequate, but he wrote them anyway, because it was all he could do. Billy Hayes started talking again around day 3, tentatively at first, then in longer conversations. He talked about what he'd do when he got home, finish high school, maybe go to community college, find a job that didn't involve carrying a rifle. He talked about his sister's upcoming graduation, about his mom's diner, about normal life waiting on the other side of all this horror. "You think we'll be okay, Sarge?" he asked one evening as they sat outside watching the sun set over the South China Sea. "Like, really okay? Or is this going to mess us up forever?" Cole wanted to lie, wanted to offer reassurance and certainty, but he owed Billy honesty. "I don't know, kid. I think we'll carry it with us always. The faces, the sounds, the things we did. But I also think we'll find ways to live with it. We'll have good days and bad days. We'll wake up sometimes and think we're still there. But we'll survive this too, same way we survived everything else. One day at a time. I keep seeing their faces, the men I killed. I know they were trying to kill us, but they were people, Sarge. They had families, dreams. And I ended that." "Yeah, you did. And that's something you'll have to reconcile, Billy, but remember, you didn't start that war. You didn't choose to be there. You did what you had to do to survive, to protect your brothers. That doesn't make it easy, but it makes it necessary. Charlie Brooks joined them, his notebook tucked under his arm. I finished it, he said. The poem about Morrison. Would you like to hear it? They nodded, and Charlie read in the fading light. They'll pin a medal on your empty chest and tell your wife you died a hero's death. They'll fold a flag with military care while politicians praise your final breath. But we who lived because you chose to stay, who ran while you stood guard against the night, we know the truth that medals can't convey. You weren't a hero. You were just a man who chose to fight, not for glory, not for flag or creed, but for the friends you'd laughed with, bled beside. You stayed because we needed you to stay. You died because we needed to not die. They'll write your name in stone and speak of duty, of sacrifice and service to the nation. But in the dark, when memory cuts through time, we'll remember how you bought our salvation, not with speeches, not with grand ideals, but with your blood spilled on that concrete floor. And we'll spend our lives trying to be worthy of the gift you gave us. Nothing less. Nothing more. When Charlie finished, none of them spoke. What was there to say? Charlie had captured something essential, something true, that all the official reports and medal citations would miss. On the 7th day, they boarded a transport plane bound for Travis Air Force Base in California. Cole sat between Billy and Charlie, with Frank and Thomas across the aisle. As the plane lifted off, carrying them away from Vietnam, Cole pressed his face to the window and watched the green jungle fall away below. Somewhere down there, Morrison lay buried. Somewhere down there, men still fought and died in a war the world had stopped caring about. Somewhere down there, the jungle kept its secrets. The flight took 22 hours with stops for refueling. They crossed the Pacific, that vast blue expanse that separated the war from home, past from future. Most of the men slept, exhausted minds seeking whatever rest they could find. Cole couldn't sleep. He kept seeing faces. Morrison grinning as he told a joke. Eddie Lane teaching Billy how to write letters home. Turner joking about the steaks he'd cook when he got back to Texas. When they finally landed at Travis, stepping onto American soil for the first time in over a year, Cole expected to feel something: relief, joy, triumph. Instead, he felt disconnected, like he was watching someone else go through the motions of coming home. There were no crowds, no welcome home celebrations. Just a few officers with clipboards directing them to processing stations for final paperwork. They turned in their weapons, signed forms, received their discharge papers. 18 months of combat reduced to a manila folder full of documents. What now? Billy asked as they stood outside the processing center, civilian clothes feeling strange after so long in uniform. Now we go home, Cole said. We see our families. We try to remember who we were before all this. And if we can't remember, then we figure out who we are now. They exchanged addresses, phone numbers, promises to stay in touch that they all knew might not be kept. Trauma bonded people together, but it also made connection painful, a reminder of things best left in the past. Billy Hayes caught a bus to Indiana. Charlie Brooks flew to Montana. Frank Donovan headed back to Detroit. Thomas Reeve disappeared into a taxi bound for the airport, heading home to Oregon. One by one, the survivors scattered, each carrying their piece of the war with them. Cole caught a flight to Kansas, watching America scroll by beneath him. Farmland and cities, highways and rivers, a country at peace with itself, even as some of its sons still fought and died overseas. He wondered what they'd think, these Americans going about their ordinary lives, if they knew what men like him had endured for them. Would they care? Would it matter? His wife, Sarah, was waiting at the Wichita airport, and when Cole saw her, something inside him finally cracked. She ran to him, and he caught her, and he held her like she was the only real thing in a world full of ghosts. She was crying, and he realized he was crying too. 2 years of held-back emotion finally breaking free. "You're home," she kept saying. "You're really home." "Yeah," he managed. "I'm home." But even as he said it, part of him wondered if that was true. His body was in Kansas, but his mind was still in Vietnam, still in that bunker with Morrison, still hearing the crack of rifles and the screams of wounded men. Could someone really come home when part of them was still fighting a war on the other side of the world? His daughters, 7 and 9 now, looked at him with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. He'd been gone so long he'd become almost a stranger, someone they knew from photographs and letters, but not from daily life. They approached carefully, and when he hugged them, he was acutely aware of how gentle he needed to be, how these small girls knew nothing of violence and he needed to keep it that way. The first week home was the hardest. Everything felt wrong. The silence at night without the constant background noise of a military base, the softness of a real bed after months on the ground, the way people went about their lives as if war didn't exist. Cole found himself jumping at loud noises, scanning rooms for threats that weren't there, keeping his back to walls like he was still in a combat zone. Sarah tried to understand, but how could she? She hadn't been there. She hadn't seen what he'd seen, done what he'd done. The gulf between them felt vast, unbridgeable. At night, he'd wake up screaming, trapped in nightmares where he was back in Vietnam and his family was dying because he couldn't protect them. "Talk to me," Sarah pleaded one night after he'd woken from another nightmare. "Please, Cole, I can't help you if you won't talk to me." "I can't," he said, the words thick in his throat. "I can't put that in your head, Sarah. I can't make you see what I've seen." "Then talk to someone. A counselor, a chaplain, someone who can help you." But Cole didn't want to talk. He wanted to forget, wanted to bury it all deep and pretend it had never happened. He threw himself into work, taking a job at a local hardware store, losing himself in the simple, mundane tasks of stocking shelves and helping customers. Normal life, safe life, life where nobody was trying to kill him. 2 months after returning home, he got a phone call from Billy Hayes. The kid's voice was shaky, uncertain. Cole? It's Billy Hayes, from Vietnam." "Billy, hey kid, how are you doing?" "Not great, honestly. I'm having trouble adjusting. My mom wants me to talk to a doctor, says I'm not the same. But I don't know how to explain to them what we went through. They don't understand." "I know what you mean. Do you think about it? About Morrison and that night and everything?" "Every day, Billy. Every single day." "Me too." A pause. Then, "I'm glad you made it home, Sarge. I know I never said it properly, but thank you for everything you did for us. You don't need to thank me, kid. You held your own. You became a soldier." "Maybe. But I'm trying to figure out how to become a person again." They talked for an hour, 2 men trying to make sense of shared trauma. When they finally hung up, Cole felt marginally better. Maybe that was the key. Finding the others who'd been there, who understood without explanation. He reached out to Charlie Brooks, found the Montana native working on his family's ranch and writing poetry in his spare time. They exchanged letters, honest correspondence about the struggles of readjustment, about nightmares and guilt and the weight of survival. Frank Donovan had gone back to fixing cars in Detroit, losing himself in the mechanical precision of engines and transmissions. Thomas Reeve had moved to the Oregon coast, living alone, speaking rarely. They were all coping in their own ways, all trying to integrate the soldiers they'd become with the men they'd been before. 6 months after returning home, Cole received an invitation to a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House. Corporal Jack Morrison would be posthumously awarded the nation's highest military honor, and survivors of the engagement were invited to attend. Cole almost didn't go. The thought of seeing Morrison's widow, of participating in what felt like a political spectacle, made him sick. But Sarah convinced him. "You owe it to him," she said, "to honor his memory, to make sure his sacrifice isn't forgotten." So Cole flew to Washington, wearing his dress uniform with its new ribbons: Silver Star, Purple Heart, Vietnamese Service Medal. He met up with Kane, Billy, Charlie, Frank, and Thomas at the hotel. They looked like civilians now, but when they saw each other, the recognition was instant and profound. The ceremony itself was surreal. The president gave a speech about Morrison's heroism, about the finest traditions of American military service. Morrison's widow, Mary, received the medal with tears streaming down her face. Cole and the other survivors stood in formation, representing all the men who'd fought and died in that forgotten battle. Afterward, at a small reception, Mary Morrison sought Cole out. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 25, with red-rimmed eyes and a fragile strength that reminded him of his own wife. "Sergeant Matthews, I wanted to thank you. Jack wrote about you in his letters. He said you were the best leader he'd ever served under, that he'd follow you anywhere." Cole felt his throat close up. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm so sorry. If I'd made different choices, if I'd—" "Stop!" Her voice was firm, despite the tears. "Jack died doing exactly what he would have wanted, protecting his friends. He wouldn't want you carrying guilt for that. He'd want you to live, to be happy, to honor his sacrifice by making the most of the life he gave you." They talked for an hour, Mary sharing stories about Jack, how they'd met, their plans for, after the war, the life they'd been building together. Cole shared his own stories, Morrison's terrible jokes, his mechanical genius, his unshakable calm under fire. Together they built a picture of a man who'd been more than a soldier, more than a medal, a man who'd been loved and who'd died so others could live. As Cole flew home that night, he felt something shift inside him. The guilt didn't disappear. It would never disappear, but it loosened its grip slightly. Morrison hadn't died in vain. He'd died for something real, something that mattered. And the best way to honor that was exactly what Mary had said: to live fully, to make his survival worth something. Over the next year, Cole slowly rebuilt his life. He got counseling, started talking about his experiences with other veterans. He reconnected with Sarah, learning to be a husband again instead of just a soldier. He watched his daughters grow, teaching them to ride bikes and helping with homework, being present in ways he hadn't thought possible those first dark months. He stayed in touch with the others. Billy Hayes finished high school and started community college, studying to be a teacher. Charlie Brooks published a book of poetry, dedicating it to Morrison and all the men who hadn't made it home. Frank Donovan opened his own garage. Thomas Reeve eventually came out of his shell, finding peace in the isolation of the Oregon coast. They gathered once a year, these survivors, meeting in different cities to remember and to heal together. They talked about the war, but increasingly they talked about their lives now, successes and struggles, families and careers, the ordinary miracles of survival. 10 years after Vietnam, Cole sat on his porch watching the sun set over Kansas wheat fields. His daughters were teenagers now, navigating the usual dramas of high school. Sarah sat beside him, her hand in his, comfortable silence between them. He still had nightmares sometimes, still heard Morrison's machine gun in his dreams. But he also had days where the weight felt bearable, where he could see beauty instead of just remembering horror. He thought about Billy Hayes, now teaching 4th grade in Indiana, helping shape young minds. He thought about Charlie Brooks, whose poetry helped other veterans find words for their trauma. He thought about Frank, Thomas, Kane, all of them building lives from the ashes of what they'd survived. And he thought about Morrison, about Eddie Lane, about Turner and all the others who hadn't made it home. Their faces were fading slightly now, time's inevitable erosion of memory. But the essence of them remained, their courage, their sacrifice, their humanity. Cole Matthews had survived the last breath of valor. And in surviving, in choosing to live fully despite the weight of what he'd endured, he'd found his own form of courage. Not the courage of combat, of standing ground against impossible odds, but the courage of living, of tentar nova mentel continua. Ropening himself to love and hope and vulnerability after war had taught him that everything could be taken away in an instant. His youngest daughter, Emily, appeared at the screen door. "Dad? Mom says dinner's ready." Cole smiled at her, genuinely smiled, something that had taken years to feel natural again. "We'll be right there, sweetheart." As Sarah stood and headed inside, Cole lingered for one more moment on the porch. The Kansas sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the air warm and thick with the smell of summer grass. Somewhere far away, other soldiers were fighting other wars, enduring their own trials by fire. Someday they'd come home too, carrying their own ghosts, their own grief. He hoped they'd find what he'd found, that survival wasn't just about making it through the battle, but about making it through all the days that came after. That the true test of courage wasn't in how you faced death, but in how you chose to live. Cole took one last breath of the evening air, then turned and walked inside to his family, to his life, to the future he'd earned through blood and loss, and the mercy of impossible luck. Behind him, the sun completed its descent, and darkness came to Kansas like it came everywhere, inevitable, temporary, and followed always by another dawn. In the end, that was what Morrison's sacrifice had purchased. Not glory or victory in any traditional sense, but time. Time for men to grow old, to love, to build, to become more than the soldiers they'd been forced to be. Time to heal, however imperfectly. Time to remember. And but somewhere in that balance between memory and life, between honoring the dead and embracing the future, Cole Matthews found something approaching peace. Not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry it without being crushed by it. Not forgetting, but learning to live alongside the ghosts. As he sat down to dinner with his family, as they laughed and talked about ordinary things, school projects and weekend plans and the neighbor's new dog, Cole felt the weight he'd carried for a decade shift slightly. It would never disappear entirely. Morrison would always be in that bunker. Eddie, Turner, and Jenkins would always be missing from the table of those who made it home. But they'd wanted him to live. Morrison had died explicitly so that Cole and the others could survive. To waste that gift on guilt and self-destruction would be the real dishonor. The way to honor the fallen was to embrace the life they'd sacrificed to protect. That night, after his daughters had gone to bed and Sarah had fallen asleep beside him, Cole stood at his bedroom window looking out at the stars. They were the same stars that had looked down on Vietnam, on that bunker, on all the battlefields where men had fought and died throughout history. The same stars that would shine long after all of them, the survivors and the fallen alike, were dust. In that cosmic perspective, the war seemed both infinitely important and utterly insignificant. Important because lives had been lost, because courage had been tested, because bonds had been forged that transcended normal human connection. Insignificant because the universe didn't care, because wars came and went, because in the grand sweep of time their suffering was just one more tiny tragedy in an endless parade of human pain. But to Cole, to Billy, to Charlie and Frank and Thomas, to Mary Morrison and all the other widows and families left behind, to them it was everything, and maybe that was enough. Maybe the meaning didn't need to be cosmic or universal. Maybe it was enough that they remembered, that they honored, that they tried to make their survival worth something. Cole turned away from the window and climbed into bed beside Sarah. She stirred slightly, reaching for him even in sleep, and he held her close, grateful for the weight of her against him, for the sound of her breathing, for the simple miracle of being alive to experience this moment. Tomorrow, he'd wake up and go to work. He'd help customers find the right tools for their projects. He'd come home and help Emily with her math homework and listen to his older daughter Rachel talk about the boys she liked in her English class. He'd have dinner with his family and read the newspaper and watch television and do all the ordinary things that made up a life. And sometimes, in quiet moments, he'd remember. He'd remember Morrison's terrible jokes and Eddie's patient teaching and Turner's booming laugh. He'd remember the weight of his rifle and the smell of cordite and the fear that never quite went away. He'd remember being young and scared and so far from home. But mostly, he'd live. He'd embrace the gift he'd been given, purchased with Morrison's blood and Eddie's pain and Turner's wound. He'd live fully and completely, not because he was particularly brave or special, but because he was still here, and they weren't. And to do anything less would be a betrayal of everything they'd sacrificed. Years would pass. Cole would watch his daughters graduate high school, then college. He'd walk them down the aisle at their weddings, hold his grandchildren, grow old with Sarah beside him. The nightmares would become less frequent, though they'd never disappear entirely. The weight would become easier to carry, integrated into who he was rather than something separate and crushing. He'd attend Morrison's grave every year on the anniversary of his death, laying flowers and sitting in silence with Mary, who'd eventually remarry but never forget her first love. He'd go to veteran reunions and tell stories that got slightly more embellished each year, laughing with men who understood without explanation. He'd testify before Congress about veteran care, write letters to young soldiers serving in new wars, try in small ways to make the world slightly better than he'd found it. And on his last day, decades in the future, as he lay in a hospital bed with Sarah holding his hand and his daughters keeping vigil and his grandchildren too young to understand waiting in the hallway, on that last day, Cole Matthews would close his eyes and see Morrison one more time, not dead, not dying, but alive and grinning with that Boston accent, saying something ridiculous about the Red Sox. "Took you long enough?" Dream Morrison would say. "We've been waiting." And Cole would smile because he'd lived well, loved deeply, and honored the sacrifice in the only way that really mattered, by making the most of every single day he'd been given. The last breath of valor hadn't been Morrison's final gasp in that bunker. It had been every breath Cole and the other survivors had taken since, every moment of joy and pain and ordinary life, every choice to keep going when it would have been easier to give up, every decision to honor the dead by embracing the living. That was the real meaning of their survival, not that they'd been braver or stronger or luckier than those who'd fallen, but that they'd been given time, borrowed time, purchased time, time that came with an obligation to make it matter. And Cole Matthews had made it matter. Not through grand gestures or heroic deeds, but through the quiet heroism of ordinary life lived fully. Through being a good husband, a good father, a good friend, through carrying his grief without letting it destroy him. Through remembering without being trapped in the past, through living. That was his victory, his triumph, his last breath of valor, choosing every day to take another breath, to face another morning, to embrace another chance at life. Morrison had given him that gift, and Cole had spent it well. As sleep finally claimed him that night in Kansas, surrounded by the ordinary comforts of home and family, Cole Matthews felt something he'd been searching for since the war. Not peace, exactly, but acceptance. An understanding that he'd done the best he could with what he'd been given. That he'd honored his fallen brothers not through guilt or grief alone, but through the fullness of the life he'd built. And in the darkness of that Kansas night, beneath those same eternal stars that had watched over battlefields since the dawn of human conflict, a sergeant who'd survived the impossible finally allowed himself to rest.